Okay. Dragonsong, Chapter 1. Drummer beat and piper blow, harper strike and soldier go. Free the flame and sear the grasses, till the dawning red star passes. Almost as if the elements too mourn the death of the gentle old harper, a southeaster blew for 3 days, locking even the burial barge in the safety of the dock cavern. The storm gave sea-holder Yanis too much time to brood over his dilemma. It gave him time to speak to every man who could keep rhythm and pitch, and they all gave him the same answer. They couldn't properly honor the old harper with his death song, but Manoli could. To which Yanis would grunt and stamp off. It rankled in his mind that he couldn't give voice to his dissatisfaction with that answer, and his frustration. Manoli was only a girl, too tall and lanky to be a proper girl at that. It galled him to have to admit that, unfortunately, she was the only person in the entire half-circle sea-hold who could play any instrument as well as the old harper. Her voice was true, her fingers clever on string, stick, or pipe, and she knew the death song. For all Yanis could be certain, the aggravating child had been practicing that song ever since old Peterian started burning with his fatal fever. She will have to do the honor, Yanis, his wife Mavi told him the evening the storm began to slacken. The important thing is that Peterian is properly sung to rest. One does not have to record who did the singing. The old man knew he was dying. Why didn't he instruct one of the men? Because, replied Mavi with a touch of sharpness in her voice, you would never spare him a man when there was fishing. There was young Tranalty, whom you sent fostering to Istaseed Hold. Couldn't that young man afford it? His voice is changing. Come, Yanis. It'll have to be Manoli. Yanis grumbled bitterly against the inevitable as he climbed into the sleeping furs. That's what everyone else has told you, haven't they? So why make so much of a necessity? Yanis settled himself, resigned. The fishing will be good tomorrow, his wife said, yawning. She preferred him fishing to stomping around the hold, sullen and critical with enforced inactivity. She knew he was the finest sea-holder half-circle had ever had. The hold was prospering, with plenty for bartering set by in the storage caves. They hadn't lost a ship or a man in several turns either, which said much for his weather wisdom. But Yanis, at home on a heaving deck in foul weather, was very much adrift when taxed with the unexpected on land. Mavi was keenly aware that Yanis was displeased with his youngest child. Mavi found the girl exasperating too. Manoli worked hard and was very clever with her fingers. Too clever by half when it came to playing any instrument in the harper craft. Perhaps Mavi thought she had not been wise to permit the girl to linger in the old harper's constant company once she had learned all the proper teaching songs. But it had been one less worry to let Manoli nurse the old harper, and Peterian had wished it. No one begrudged a harper's requests. Ah, well, thought Mavi, dismissing the past, there'd be a new harper soon, and Manoli could be put to task proper to a young girl. The next morning the storm had cleared off. The skies were cloudless, the sea calm. The burial barge had been outfitted in the dock cavern, Peterian's body wrapped in harper blue on the tiller board. The entire fleet and most of the sea-hold followed in the wake of the oar-driven barge out into the faster-moving current above Nerat Deep. Manoli on the barge prow sang the elegy, her clear, strong voice carrying back to the half-circle fleet, the men chanting the descant as they rowed the barge. On the final chord, Peterian went to his rest. Manoli bowed her head and let drum and stick slide from her fingers into the sea. How could she ever use them again when they had beaten Peterian's last song? She held back her tears since the harper had died, because she knew she had been able to sing his elegy, had to be able to sing his elegy, and you couldn't sing with a throat closed from crying. Now the tears ran down her cheeks, mingled with sea spray, her sobs punctuated by the soft chant of the steersman setting about. Peterian had been her friend, her ally and mentor. She had sung from the heart as he'd taught her, from the heart and the gut. Had he heard her song where he had gone? She raised her eyes to the palisades of the coast, to the white sanded harbor between the two arms of half-circle hold. The sky had wept itself out in the past 3 days, a fitting tribute, and the air was cold. She shivered in her thick ware-hide jacket. She would have some protection from the wind if she stepped down into the cockpit with the oarsmen, but she couldn't move. Honor was always accompanied by responsibility, and it was fitting for her to remain where she was until the burial barge touched the stones of Dock Cavern. Half-Circle Hold would be lonelier than ever for her now. Batarian had tried so hard to live long enough for his replacement to arrive. He'd told Manoli he wouldn't last the winter. He'd dispatched a message to Master Harper Robinson to send a new harper as soon as possible. He'd also told Manoli that he'd sent 2 of her songs to the Master Harper. "Women can't be harpers," she'd said to Batarian, astonished and awed. 1 in 10,000 have perfect pitch, Batarian had said in one of his evasive replies. 1 in 10,000 can build an acceptable melody with meaningful words. Were you only a lad, there'd be no problem at all. Well, we're stuck with me being a girl. You'd make a big, fine, strong lad, you would, Batarian had replied exasperatingly. And what's wrong with being a fine, big, strong girl, Manoli had said, half teasing, half annoyed. Nothing, surely, nothing. And Batarian had patted her hand, smiling up at her. She'd been helping him eat his dinner, his hand so crippled even the lightest wooden spoon left terrible ridges in the swollen fingers. And Master Harper Robinson's a fair man. No one on Pern can say he isn't. And he'll listen to me. He knows his duty, and I am, after all, a senior member of the craft hall, being taught up in the craft before him himself, and I'll require him to listen to you. Have you really sent him those songs you made me wax down on slates? I have. Sure, I have done that much for you, dear child. He'd been so emphatic that Manoli had to believe that he'd done what he'd said. Poor old Batarian. In the last months, he'd not remembered the times of turn, much less what he'd done the day before. He was timeless now, Manoli told herself, her wet cheeks stinging with cold, and she'd never forget him. The shadow of the 2 arms of Half-Circle's cliffs fell across her face. The barge was entering the home harbor. She lifted her head. High above, she saw the diminutive outline of a dragon in the sky. How lovely. And how had Bendon Weir known? No, the dragon rider was only doing a routine sweep. With thread falling at unexpected times, dragons were often flying above Half-Circle, isolated as it was by the bogs at the top of Nerat Bay. No matter. The dragon was awing above Half-Circle Hold at this appropriate moment, and that was, to Manoli, the final tribute to Batarian the harper. The men lifted the heavy oars out of the water, and the barge glided slowly to its mooring at the far end of the dock. Fort and Tillich might boast of being the oldest sea holds, but only Half-Circle had a cavern big enough to dock the entire fishing fleet and keep it safe from threadfall and weather. Dock Cavern had moorings for 30 boats, storage space for all the nets, traps and lines, airing racks for sail, and a shallow ledge where hulls could be scraped free of sea growth and repaired. At the very end of the immense cavern was a shelf of rock where the hold's builders worked when there was sufficient timber for a new hull. Beyond was the small inner cave where priceless wood was stored, dried on high racks or warped into frames. The burial barge lightly touched its pier. Manoli, the first oarsman, held out a hand to her. Startled by the unexpected courtesy to a girl her age, she was about to jump down when she saw in his eyes the respect due her at this moment, and his hand closing on hers gave silent approval for her singing of the harper's elegy. The other men stood too, waiting for her to disembark first. She straightened her shoulders, although her throat felt tight enough for more tears, and she stepped proudly down to the solid stone. As she turned to walk back to the land side of the cavern, she saw that the other boats were discharging their passengers quickly and quietly. Her father's boat, the biggest of the Half-Circle fleet, had already tacked back into the harbor. Yanis's voice carried across the water, above the incidental sounds of creaking boats and muted voices. Quickly now, men. We've got a good breeze rising, and the fish'll be biting after 3 days of storm. The oarsmen hurried past her to board their assigned fishing boats. It seemed unfair to Manoli that Batarian, after a long life's dedication to Half-Circle Hold, was dismissed so quickly from everyone's mind. And yet, life did go on. There were fish to be caught against winter's hungry months, Fair days during the cold months of the turn were not to be squandered. She quickened her pace. She'd far to go around the rim of the dark cavern, and she was cold. Manoli also wanted to get into the hold before her mother noticed that she didn't have the drum. Waste wasn't tolerated by Mavi any more than idleness by Yanis. Well, this was an occasion. It had been a sad one, and the women and children, and also the men too old to see fish, observed a decorous pace out of the cavern, making smaller groups as they headed toward their own holds in the southern arc of half-circles sheltering palisade. Manoli saw Mavi organizing the children into work groups. With no harper to lead them in the teaching songs and ballads, the children would be kept occupied in clearing the storm debris from the white-sanded beaches. There might be sun in the sky, and the dragon rider still circling on his brown, but the wind was frigid, and Manoli began to shiver violently. She wanted to feel the warmth of the fire on the great hold's kitchen hearth and a cup of hot claw inside her. She heard her sister Sella's voice carrying to her on the breeze. "She's got nothing to do now, Mavi. Why do I have to—" Manoli ducked behind a group of adults, avoiding her mother's searching glance. Trust Sella to remember that Manoli no longer had the excuse of nursing the ailing Harper. Ahead of her, one of the old aunts tripped, her querulous voice raised in a cry for help. Manoli sprinted to her side, supporting her and receiving loud protestations of gratitude. "Only for Batarian would I have dragged these old bones out on the cold sea this morning. Bless the man, rest the man," the old woman went on, clinging with unexpected strength to Manoli. "You're a good child, Manoli, so you are. It is Manoli, isn't it?" The old one peered up at her. "Now you just give me a hand up to old uncle and I'll tell him the whole of it, since he hasn't legs to leave his bed." So Sella had to supervise the children, and Manoli got to the fire, at least long enough to stop shivering. Then old auntie would have it that the uncle would be grateful for some claw too. So when Mavi entered her kitchen, her eyes searching for her youngest daughter, she found Manoli dutifully occupied serving the oldster. "Very well then, Manoli, while you're up there, see that you set the old man comfortably. Then you can start on the glows." Manoli had her warming cup with the old uncle and left him comfortable, mournfully exchanging tales of other burials with the aunt. Checking the glows had been her task ever since she'd grown taller than Sella. It had meant climbing up and down the different levels to the inner and outer layers of the huge sea hold, but Manoli had established the quickest way to finish the job so that she'd have some free time to herself before Mavi started looking for her. She'd been accustomed to spending those earned minutes practicing with the harper, so Manoli was not surprised to find herself eventually outside Batarian's door. She was surprised, however, to hear voices in his room. She was about to charge angrily through the half-open door and demand an accounting when she heard her mother's voice clearly. "The room won't need much fixing for the new harper, so it won't." Manoli stepped back into the shadow of the corridor. "The new harper? What I want to know, Mavi, is who is to keep the children up in their learning until he comes?" That voice was Surreal's, the wife of the first holder and therefore spokeswoman for the other hold women to Mavi as sea holder's lady. "She did well enough this morning. You have to give her that, Mavi." "Yanis will send the message ship." "Not today, nor tomorrow he won't." "I don't fault sea holder, Mavi, but it stands to reason that the boats must fish and the sloop's crew can't be spared. That means 4-5 days before the messenger gets to Egan Hold. From Egan Hold, if a dragon rider obliges by carrying the message, but we all know what the old-timers at Egan Weir are like, so let's say harper drums to the harper hall at Fort is another 2-3 days. A man has to be selected by Master Harper and Robinson and sent overland and by ship. And with thread falling any time it pleases, no one travels fast or far in a day. It'll be spring before we see another harper. Are the children to be left without teaching for months?" Surreal had punctuated her comments with brushing sounds, and there were other clatters in the room, the swishing of bed rushes being gathered up. Now Manoli could hear the murmur of 2 other voices supporting Surreal's arguments. "But Tyrion has taught her well." "He taught her well, too," Surreal interrupted Mavi. "Harpering is a man's occupation." "Fair enough, if the sea holder'll spare a man for it." Surreal's voice was almost belligerent because everyone knew the answer to that. "Truth be told, I think the girl knew the sagas better than the old man this past turn. You know his mind was ranging back in time, Mavi." "Yanis will do what's proper." The finality in Mavi's tone firmly ended that discussion. Manoli heard footsteps crossing the old Harper's room, and she ducked down the hall, around the nearest bend, and down into the kitchen level. It distressed Manoli to think of anyone, even another Harper, in Peterian's room. Obviously, it distressed others that there was no Harper. Usually such a problem didn't arise. Every hold could boast one or two musically able men, and every hold took pride in encouraging these talents. Harpers liked to have other instrumentalists to share the chore of entertaining their holds during the long winter evenings. And it was also the better part of wisdom to have a substitute available for just such an emergency as Half Circle was experiencing. But fishing was hard on the hands. The heavy work, the cold water, the salt and fish oils, thickened joints and calloused fingers in the wrong places. Fishermen were often away many days on longer hauls. After a turn or two at net, trap, and sail line, young men lost their skill at playing anything but simple tunes. Harper teaching ballads required deft, quick fingers and constant practice. By putting to sea to fish so quickly after the old Harper's burial, Yennis thought to have time enough to find an alternative solution. There was no doubt that the girl could sing well, play well, and she'd not disgraced Hold or Harper that morning. It was going to take time to send for and receive a new Harper, and the youngsters must not lose all progress in the learning of the basic teaching ballads. But Yennis had many strong reservations about putting such a heavy responsibility on the shoulders of a girl not 15. Not 15 turns old. Not the least of these was Manoli's distressing tendency toward tune-making. Well enough and amusing now and again in the long winter evenings to hear her sing them, but old Peterian had been alive to keep her to rights. Yennis wasn't sure that he could trust her not to include her trivial little whistles in the lessons. How were the young to know that hers weren't proper songs for their learning? The trouble was her melodies were the sort that stayed in the mind, so a man found himself humming or whistling them without meaning to. By the time the boats had profitably trawled the deep and tacked for home, Yennis had found no compromise. It was no consolation to know that he wouldn't have any argument from the other holders. Had Manoli sung poorly that morning? But she hadn't. As sea holder for Half Circle, he was obliged to bring up the young of the hold in the traditions of Pern, knowing their duty and how to do it. He counted himself very lucky to be beholden to Bend and Weir, to have Flaw, our bronze Menmouth rider, as Weir leader, and Lessa as Ramos Weirwoman. So Yennis felt deeply obliged to keep tradition at Half Circle, and the young would learn what they needed to know, even if a girl had to do the teaching. That evening, after the day's catch had been salted down, he instructed Mavie to bring her daughter to the small room off the great hall, where he conducted hold business and where the records were stored. Mavie had put the Harper's instruments on the mantel for safekeeping. Appropriately, Yennis handed Manoli Peterian's guitar. She took the instrument in a properly reverential manner, which reassured Yennis that she appreciated the responsibility. "Tomorrow you'll be excused from your regular morning duties to take the youngsters for their teaching," he told her. "But I'll have no more of those finger-twiddlings of yours." "I sang my songs when Peterian was alive, and you never minded them." Yennis frowned at his tall daughter. "Peterian was alive. He's dead now, and you'll obey me in this." Over her father's shoulders, Manoli saw her mother's frowning face, saw her warning head shake, and held back a quick reply. "You'll bear in mind what I've said," and Yennis fingered the wide belt he wore. "No tuning." "Yes, Yennis."
I don't like Yennis.
"Start tomorrow, then."
No one does.
He's a good holder, but he's not a good father, is he?
No.
It is important when you evaluate other people to look at them fairly. He's good at running his hold, but he is a bad dad. "Start tomorrow, then. Unless, of course, they're threadfall, and then everyone will bait long lines." Yennis dismissed the two women and began to compose a message to the Master Harper to go when he could next spare the sloop's crew. They'd sail it to Egan Hold. About time Half Circle had some news of the rest of Pern anyway, and he could ship some of the smoked fish. The journey needn't be a wasted trip. Once in the hallway, Mavie gripped her daughter's arm hard. "Don't disobey him, girl." "There's no harm in my tunes, Mother. You know what Peterian said." "I'll remind you that the old man's dead, and that changes everything that went on during his life. Now behave yourself while you stand in a man's place. No tuning." To bed now. And mind you turn the glow baskets. No sense wasting light. No eye needs.
Okay, they're both bad at parenting.
You think? So, I don't much care for Yanis or Mavi as parents. I don't think they encourage their daughter enough. But have you paid attention to what the culture of this world is? So, why do you think Mavi is telling Manoli not to play her tunes?
Because it's not traditional?
There's that, and that's a very important piece of it. But also, what did Yanis suggest that he would do? He did it with a gesture. What did he suggest he would do if he caught her playing tunes?
Use the belt.
Use the belt to do what?
Hit her.
So why do you think Mavi doesn't want Manoli to disobey Yanis?
Because she doesn't want her to get hurt. Personally, I think Mavi is scared of Yanis.
Well, in this particular culture, the sea holder gets to do whatever he wants as long as it's within tradition. So, would that give people a reason to be scared?
Yeah.
So when I told you that this book was set in feudal times, on a different world, it really is. The holders, the lord holders, the sea holders, they're in charge in a way that nobody in our culture is. Okay? Alright. Sorry. We had a little social lesson here at the end of the tape. We'll be reading chapter 2 tomorrow. Bye, everybody.
Bye.